These are the texts from the Common Lectionary that will be used in churches that typically utilize the Common Lectionary on June the 2nd of this year. During the summer, we enter this time to where if you happen to be looking at a lectionary, you're going to see some additional Old Testament texts. Well, there's actually two different lectionaries that are being followed. The Common Lectionary, which utilizes from the Old Testament text that we would call semi-continuous. Typically in the summer, they tell a story in a continuous or semi-continuous fashion. So this summer, those semi-continuous texts are going to start with Samuel and work mostly through the life of David. There are other years where the semi-continuous texts have a lot more to do with the sagas in Genesis, for example. I like to stick with those. Those are the ones in the Common Lectionary. It really doesn't matter. In our Presbyterian tradition, we are free to do whatever we want, whether we want to use a lectionary or not. So, big deal. But I will be continuing through the summer using those semi-continuous texts. And today we start with the call of Samuel. Samuel is a fascinating character. He acts as priest, prophet, and judge. He's a real bridge character, I think, between the old ways and the times of the kingdom. But this story in particular, and by the way, if you happen to look at a calendar that has the Common Lectionary, it will say verses 1 through 10 of chapter 3. And then in parentheses, verses 11 through 20 of the same chapter. I always suggest read what's in parentheses because sometimes there's some really great stuff in there. And I think that what happens in there today is, I'll touch on that briefly. I also think that there are going to be one, maybe two sort of themes that weave through these texts in a way that I hope I can make a little bit clear for you today. But let's begin with the story of Samuel. Samuel is a small child. He was given over to, to back up on the story, his mother, Hannah, was barren, and she prayed for a child. And basically, as a thanks to God, when she got a child, she promised to give that child to God for the dedicated service of God. And so shortly after Samuel was weaned, and at that day and age, a child was weaned at about 3 years of age, she gave him to the temple. There's no indication in the story about how much the temple appreciated a toddler to have to look after. But anyway, and exactly what the full extent of giving the child to the temple of God at that time means, I don't know, and I'm not going to bother to dig it up. If that's of interest to you, start digging, and I'd be interested to know. At any rate, by that age, he is dedicated to the life in the temple. At some later moment during his early youth, he is serving Eli. There's nothing in here that says he's taken on any priestly characteristics. He's probably just sort of a step and fetch it. You know, whatever Eli wants him to do, whether it's shine my shoes or go get me something to eat or, you know, light a candle or whatever, that's kind of what he is doing. And there's an interesting phrase in here as well. Well, there's two interesting phrases. One is the text is telling us this was a time when there were very few words coming from Yahweh. You know, people weren't picking up any kind of a sense of direction from God. It also tells us that at this time, the text says, Samuel did not yet know the Lord. Now, I want to be careful about this know the Lord because in a lot of evangelical understandings in our modern era, to know the Lord means something about our relationship with God in a personal kind of a way. I'm really not sure what this means here. It's probably a word study that I should have done today before we started to talk. But let's be clear on it that Samuel's role in the temple has nothing to do with how closely he feels associated with the will and direction of God. That's probably the best way we can say it. At any rate, if you're a longtime church person, you know the story. 3 times in the night, Samuel thinks he hears Eli, the priest, calling him. And 3 times Eli says, "It's not me, go back." And finally, on the 3rd time, Eli says, "You know, this must be the Lord calling you." The next time the Lord calls, say, "Here am I." And so that's what Samuel does, and he gets a word from the Lord. So now we have in this this sense of call to Samuel. But that's where it stops. That's where 11 through 20 becomes so fun. I love verse 11. Then the Lord said to Samuel, after Samuel finally said, "Here I am." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle." And then he talks about how Eli's boys, who are also priests, have been evil in the sight of God, blaspheming God. And so the whole house of Eli too, are going to be devastated, and Samuel's going to be the new priest at some point in time, probably not tomorrow, the next day. Now, where I think there's going to be a theme that carries through is a theme of evil, innocence, naivety, how we often step into things with no evil intent, and we don't mean evil, and we're not doing evil, but we do things that are off-putting to others. Where Eli fits into this, was he simply naive about the goings-on of his own sons? Was he permissive and knew what they were doing, but because they were his boys, he didn't want to correct them? Now, by his boys, these are adult men, of course. Or was he simply part of it? There's no indication about Eli being part of whatever blasphemy his boys are up to as priests. But there is something about accidents, not a car collision, but the wrong place at the wrong time, things that may have been sort of beyond our control, or that we didn't take control when we could, that may be at work here with Eli. Because to Eli's credit, he makes no excuses when he hears this word from young Samuel. Instead, Eli says, "It is the Lord, let the Lord do what seems good to him." So I suggest that that means at minimum that Eli is not some bad rascal. But given his role and responsibility, he clearly wasn't up to the task once his boys, they were boys. Once his boys, who are now men and now priests in the house of Eli, that he was not up to the task of governing them for whatever reason. Would he have been up to the task if he'd had no sons and there were others who were priests underneath him? We don't know. But when it came to his own kin, he failed in the sight of God. Now, let's move on to the psalm. The psalm we actually took up back in maybe February, the second Sunday of the season of Epiphany. Same psalm, Psalm 139. The lectionary skips around. The psalm is not all that long. Read the whole thing. It is in several different pieces. It is what appears to be some excerpts from someone who is claiming their innocence before God. Now, the first part of the psalm, which I have read before and utilized separately, is one where the recognition of the psalmist is, there's no way I can get away from you. You know me. You know me intimately. You know when I rise up, when I lie down. You know where I go. You're acquainted with everything I do. You know the words I'm about to speak before I can speak them, and so forth and so on. But what this amounts to, this is an appeal to the Lord to right some wrong that is being done against this person. Again, was this an accusation of great evil doing? Was it simply an accusation against him that he had goofed in some way, and the penalty for that goof is heavier than the goof he made? You know, those kinds of things do happen in real life. We really don't know. But first, this man is going into an extensive appeal. I should say this psalmist. It was probably a man, but there's no indication either way. But clearly, this psalmist is going into a very lengthy appeal about how God knows him and knows that he would never do evil in the sight of God. I shouldn't have put quotation marks around it. That's like out of whatever that movie was, Austin Powers with evil. No, but he's professing his sense that he did not do evil in the sight of God. Then when you move to the end, beginning in verse 19, oh, that you would kill the wicked. We clearly see that's implied in this text that the wicked are those who have come against him in some way. We don't know what it is. But think about the turmoil that happens in real life, sometimes between neighbors, sometimes between husbands and wives who get out of sorts with each other, and it becomes this entangled mess that just feeds on itself, and sometimes over very minor things that created it. We don't know here. We don't know if the people who are accusing him are deliberately wicked or utterly incensed by some offense that our psalmist has made, or perceived offense that the psalmist has made. But he is appealing in the temple for a higher authority than the governing courts of the land, because clearly he's not getting satisfaction there. And so he moves into, oh, that you would slay the wicked and the bloodthirsty. And then his appeal moves back to, look, I hate those who hate you. We got to be careful with the word hate here. What this psalmist is doing is indicating to God that he is on God's side, and God hates evil. And so that's what he means, more than I hate that person who's accusing me. But Lord, anything that's truly evil, I'm on your side. I hate it just like you hate it. And then at the very end, he puts himself wide open to God with, go ahead and search me and see if there's any wickedness in me. And if there happens to be, lead me in the way everlasting. So at the end, there's a kind of confession that, maybe I've done something wrong and I'm not really aware of that. But if that's the case, then I appeal to you to show it to me so that I can mend my ways. It's like a lot of Psalms. It begins in a type of a lamentation, but it ends in this wonderful, wonderful way of, once the person has vented themselves fully, they are open to refreshment from God, even to the point of saying, maybe I have done something that I shouldn't have, but show me that so that I can, by your guidance, change my ways. Beautiful psalm in that way. I kind of see the link with Eli here, although the judgment is final because of Eli's responsibility in their culture. Responsibility as the priest of the only temple in Israel at that time, that whatever the judgment is, it's permanent. It's kind of like people who get fired from something, even when the business owner regrets it, or the CEO that gets fired because he hasn't been able to do the things that were intended of him. Also through the summer, largely we're going to be following the Gospel of Mark. I shouldn't have said that. We're going to do Corinthians first. So we'll be following Mark throughout, and that section, I think, is going to link to the Psalm 139, I think, fairly clearly, as does our text from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Now, a word about 2 Corinthians in general. Sometimes I've probably said this. I'm not sure I always have. But 2 Corinthians is not just one letter. It's at least two. I think it's more than two, and maybe several more than two. There's probably a clear jump that indicates a second letter long around chapter 10. But I think that even in today's text, we might be finding a compilation of several letters. You know, there's no need for us to think that this whole thing was simply one letter. And the way 2 Corinthians in particular bounces in a few different directions, it does sound as though Paul is responding to a variety of things at different places, and they just all get lumped together later. Now, this is a fascinating section to me, and yeah, I think this is intact enough. You can read before it and after it, that's just fine, but it's intact much on its own, chapter 4, verses 5 through 12. Paul is defending himself against accusations, and the accusations have to do with the nature of his ministry. There are other Christians who don't like Paul's ministry. They may even be offended by it, and the way he delivers the gospel to people. And you know, I'm mindful of the fact that later in 2 Corinthians, Paul is going to say, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Whether that actually comes later, I suggest that came earlier, and just because it's only in 2 Corinthians does not mean that that was not a repeated theme by Paul in other places. Now, don't get me wrong about this. I think what Paul means about be imitators of me as I am of Christ is I seek to behave as Christ would behave. And since you no longer have Christ in the flesh, when you see the pattern that I am striving for, strive for that same pattern of imitating Christ. Now, I think that's what he really means. I don't think it's arrogant, but you can see how if someone, or if the preacher said to you, be imitators of me as I am of Christ, that might set off all kinds of alarm bells, unintentionally, innocently delivered by Paul in this case. But on the part of some other Christians, this sounds very bad, like you're a model, and yet we all know that all humans are sinners. So I think that helps us to set this up. And then Paul's going to do a wonderful thing that I'm going to focus on right here. I really, looking at verses 5 and 6, Paul says, we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. Now, I think you could almost put brackets and say that what Paul said here was, we don't proclaim ourselves to be lords over you. We proclaim Christ as the one and only Lord. So he's beginning to set this up as somehow, look people, whatever I have said, you may have misconstrued it because there's only one Lord, only one person to follow, and it's not me, it's Jesus Christ who is the Lord. Now he's going to make an interesting flip that I think helps us to understand what Paul viewed about himself and about human nature in general. He starts with, I've lost it. He starts with, for it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. Now, Paul's going to flip on that a little bit and say, but we have this treasure, that is this light from God. We have this light from God, and it is in clay jars. Well, light is light. It's pure. What Paul is conveying here is the imperfection of a clay jar. This light from God, which is given to us, that we give to you, comes from people that are clay. Now, we all do understand that, the clay jar bit, or the feet of clay bit. But here with the clay jars, Paul is admitting that at best, in conveying the gospel is never as seen purely as it comes from God, because it's coming from us. Paul, in this way, I think, is admitting his own quirks he doesn't even know about, but quirks someone else may have pointed out to say, by the very nature of how you talk, you are arrogant, and therefore I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not so sure Paul is actually arrogant. I used to think that, but the more I have looked into his life, particularly as I watch through the book of Acts, I think that anytime somebody accuses Paul, it forces him to sit back and rethink, not necessarily to change who he is, but to rethink how his enthusiasm with the gospel may be off-putting to some. And so this whole explanation of the clay jars, I think, is a powerful way that Paul is saying, yeah, everything we do is going to be imperfect, even though we seek to proclaim the gospel. So you can see how this might actually link with a psalm like 139, where someone feels accused but doesn't think they've done anything wrong. The same thing's going to happen here for us in the Gospel of Mark. I almost wish Mark had not taken on the stories that he has as a whole, but had divided them up. Mark chapter 2. I like the Gospel of Mark, partly because it's short, and I think it makes it easier to scan through and to see elements in Mark and to put some things together in a way I'm not quite sure I do it as well with, well, I'm probably do it with Matthew as well, but Matthew was really modeled on the Gospel of Mark. But the stories in the Gospel of Mark here are fascinating in this section. There are two here that you could back up a little bit for the paralytic coming through the roof, but there are two here that have to do with accusations coming from the Pharisees. The first one has to do with Jesus' disciples. They're on the Sabbath, they're going through a grain field, and they pluck the heads of grain, and the Pharisees say that what they're doing is not lawful on the Sabbath. In Old Testament law, you could pluck grains from a grain field on the Sabbath, but you couldn't store them in jars as though you were busy with the work for the rest of the week. You could take enough to sustain you for the day, but you couldn't go shopping, with grocery bags, go shopping with baskets and load up for the next days of the week. So I don't know that that's happened here. Jesus takes this in quite a different direction. He mentions about Sabbath law, and this is a powerful sense of all law, and it's a good reminder, I think, for our lawmakers in our country as well, when Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. The law, you could put it like this, the law was made for us. We were not made for the law. And that has a sense of what the purpose of real law is about, is it not? It's not to restrict us, but to find the way that frees us to live in community with each other. A wonderful notion that he says as a correction to the Pharisees. The second one is in chapter 3, and it has to do with the man with the withered hand. And Jesus heals him on the Sabbath. And so he gets accused again of disobeying Sabbath law. And he explains to them and challenges them, is it lawful to do harm or good on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? Well, they all know that in the case of an emergency, whatever the Sabbath law was no longer counts. You deal with the emergency. So that's why he puts it in those stark terms of save a life or to kill, do good or do harm. Now, law, when it came to human beings, you could save a life, but I don't know if a withered hand is so much saving a life. Doesn't matter. The way Jesus observes it is, as long as one is doing something that's helpful to other people, it's all fine on the Sabbath. Now, you can imagine there were plenty of people cheering him on, both when he and the Pharisees confronted each other about grain in the field on one Sabbath, and on another Sabbath when he heals a man with a withered hand. And the people who heard the confrontation are delighted that Jesus put these rulers in their place. But note what else is happening now. The very last verse of it. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. You know, this is the no good deed goes unpunished thing, of course. But there's something else here. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the Pharisees hated the Herodians. And the Herodians despised the Pharisees. But now in Jesus, who is riling up the people, is their common enemy. So once again, we see the goodness of the Christ, the setting right of the law by the Christ, the innocence of the Christ, and yet he is being viewed as and accused of evil against both the religious authorities and religion and against the law, the ruling government. I think it's a good place for us to stop here and think about how innocence and guilt sometimes doesn't really mean evil, but it means running up against the way people think about religion or the law. I hearken back more and more to the Apostle Paul in these things. And it does seem to me that whenever he has been accused of a thing, it really helps him to explain even more, for me at least, the human condition and how we need to be gentle with each other unless we recognize true and pure evil. But other than true and pure evil, the harming of another person, for example, it's good to have a sense of humility about the clay jars that we ourselves are, and the clay jar that we may be viewing in the person of another who may be making their best efforts to do what they believe is the call of Christ. Hope to see you next week. Bye. Edit this puppy down and get back to business.